In 1935 New York, a single insult at a white's only club set off a chain reaction no one saw coming, and the man on the receiving end was Bumpy Johnson. What happened next didn't just settle a score, it quietly reshaped power in Harlem. Before we dive in, quick question, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments. And if you appreciate real history backed by true data, make sure you subscribe. A lot of time and effort went into digging through verified accounts and historical sources to bring you stories like this accurately, not exaggerated or made up. In 1935, New York City was a place of sharp contrasts where opportunity and oppression existed side by side. The city was booming culturally and economically, yet it remained deeply segregated. Jim Crow laws may have been more visible in the South. In the North, racism operated through unwritten rules: who could enter certain buildings, where people could sit, and which neighborhoods they were expected to stay in. Whites only clubs were one of the clearest symbols of this hidden segregation, enforcing racial boundaries with quiet cruelty and public humiliation. Harlem, meanwhile, was the heart of black life in New York. It was a center of music, art, politics, and business, but also a community under constant pressure from discrimination and poverty. Black residents were often denied access to mainstream power structures, forcing them to create their own systems of influence and protection. This environment produced leaders, hustlers, activists, and figures who understood that survival required intelligence, strategy, and sometimes force. Bumpy Johnson emerged from this world as a man shaped by both brilliance and brutality, known for his sharp mind and commanding presence. He was not just a street enforcer, but a thinker who read philosophy and history. He understood power, not only how to take it, how to hold it. By the mid-1930s, Johnson had already built a reputation in Harlem as someone who demanded respect and did not forget slights, especially when they were rooted in racial contempt. Whites only clubs in New York were designed to make that contempt unmistakable. They weren't just social spaces, they were declarations of who mattered and who didn't. Doormen were often the front line enforcers of this hierarchy, given authority to insult, dismiss, and degrade black patrons without consequence. A single remark at the door could strip a man of dignity in front of a crowd, reinforcing the message that no amount of success or intelligence could overcome race. When Bumpy Johnson encountered this reality, it wasn't just another act of discrimination. It was a calculated insult meant to remind him of his place. The humiliation was public, deliberate, and symbolic. In a city where reputation was everything, especially in Harlem, such an insult carried weight far beyond the moment itself. It challenged not only Johnson's pride, but his standing within his own community. What made this moment dangerous was not Johnson's temper, but his restraint. Unlike others who might have reacted immediately, Johnson absorbed the insult and walked away. Those who knew him understood that silence did not mean surrender, it meant calculation. He believed that true power came from timing and precision, not impulsive violence, especially in a city watching every move of black men labeled as troublemakers. This incident would soon ripple through Harlem, becoming a quiet test of authority and respect in a racially divided city. What began as a doorman's insult would evolve into something much larger, a lesson about power, memory, and consequence in 1935 New York. And while the club believed it had asserted dominance, it had unknowingly set events in motion that would challenge the very assumptions it stood on. Before the incident at the Whites Only Club, Bumpy Johnson was already a known figure in Harlem, though not yet a legend to the wider public. Born Ellsworth Raymond Johnson in 1905, he grew up in South Carolina before being sent to Harlem as a teenager after clashing with white authority figures in the South. Harlem in the 1920s and early 1930s was a place where ambition could thrive, but only if you understood its rules. Johnson arrived young, angry, intelligent, and determined not to be powerless in a city that treated black men as disposable. From early on, Johnson stood out for more than just his willingness to fight. He was physically imposing, fearless, and quick to defend his reputation. But what truly separated him from others on the street was his mind. He read constantly, philosophy, poetry, and history, developing a worldview that mixed pride, strategy, and a deep awareness of racial injustice. This combination made him dangerous in a different way. He didn't just react to the world as it was. He studied it, learned from it, planned around it. By the early 1930s, Johnson had become involved in Harlem's underground economy, which existed largely because legitimate opportunities were closed off to black residents. Gambling, numbers running, and protection rackets filled the gap left by systemic exclusion. Johnson navigated this world carefully, earning a reputation as someone who could be trusted, but never tested lightly. Respect in Harlem was currency, and Johnson accumulated plenty of it. His rise also put him in close proximity to powerful figures, including Madame Stephanie St. Clair, Queen of Harlem, who ran a massive numbers operation. Johnson became one of her most loyal and effective lieutenants. Under her influence, he learned discipline, loyalty, and the importance of organization over chaos. Claire valued intelligence and control, and she recognized those qualities in Johnson early on, further sharpening his sense of long-term power. Despite his criminal associations, Johnson was not seen simply as a brute within the community. Many Harlem residents viewed him as a protector, someone who stood up to both rival gangs and abusive police. He contributed to local causes, helped neighbors in need, carried himself with a quiet pride that resonated with people who were constantly denied dignity. This dual image, feared by enemies, respected by locals, made him a uniquely influential figure. At the same time, Johnson was well aware of how fragile his position was in a racially divided city. No matter how powerful he became in Harlem, he understood that white institutions still held the ultimate authority. Police, politicians, and wealthy elites could ignore or crush black figures whenever it suited them. That awareness fueled a simmering resentment, not just personal, but symbolic of a system stacked against him and his community. So when the insult at the Whites Only Club eventually happened, it didn't land on an unknown man or a reckless thug. It landed on someone who had spent years building a reputation, studying power, and waiting for the right moments to act. Bumpy Johnson, before that night, was already a force in Harlem. That incident would push him from respected insider to a figure whose name carried weight far beyond the neighborhood. In 1935, whites' only clubs were more than private social venues. They were powerful symbols of exclusion woven into everyday life. These establishments existed to reinforce racial boundaries without needing written laws or visible signs. Membership rules, dress codes, and selective door policies were all designed to quietly enforce who belonged and who did not in a city that claimed to be more progressive than the South. These clubs allowed segregation to thrive under the cover of tradition and respectability. For white elites, these clubs were places to network, make deals, and reinforce social hierarchy. Business partnerships, political alliances, and financial opportunities often began in these spaces, away from public scrutiny. By excluding black patrons entirely, whites' only clubs ensured that power remained concentrated within a closed circle. Access to these rooms often mattered as much as wealth or talent, because being present meant being seen, heard, and taken seriously. For black New Yorkers, these clubs represented a constant reminder that success did not guarantee acceptance. A well-dressed, educated, or wealthy black man could still be stopped at the door and humiliated without explanation. This kind of exclusion was especially damaging because it was public and deliberate. The rejection wasn't hidden. It was meant to be seen by passers-by, reinforcing the idea that racial identity outweighed personal achievement. Doormen played a crucial role in maintaining this system. They were given unchecked authority to decide who entered and who didn't, often using insults or dismissive language to assert control. Because they acted as representatives of the institution, their behavior carried the weight of the club itself. A single insult from a doorman wasn't just personal. It was institutional racism delivered face to face. These moments of exclusion also carried psychological weight. Being denied entry wasn't just about missing out on a night inside. It was about being reminded of one's imposed limits in society. For black men, trying to carve out dignity and influence in a hostile environment, such incidents could feel like deliberate attempts to strip them of status and self-worth. The message was clear: no matter who you were elsewhere, here you were nothing. At the same time, whites' only clubs inadvertently helped fuel alternative power structures within black communities. Since mainstream spaces were closed off, black entrepreneurs, leaders, and underground figures built their own networks in Harlem and beyond. Bars, clubs, and informal meeting places became centers of influence, culture, and resistance. Power didn't disappear. It simply reorganized itself outside white approval. This is why an insult at the door of a whites' only club could echo far beyond the moment itself. It wasn't just a social slight. It was a challenge issued by an entire system. For someone like Bumpy Johnson, who understood both visible and invisible power, insult represented a line being drawn, one that demanded a response, not just for himself, but for what he represented in a segregated society. The moment at the door of the whites' only club was brief, but its impact was heavy. Bumpy Johnson approached the entrance, dressed sharply, carrying himself with the confidence of a man who knew his worth. He wasn't causing a disturbance, wasn't loud, and wasn't breaking any law. Yet before he could even speak, the doorman made it clear he was not welcome. The rejection wasn't subtle. It was deliberate. meant to stop him cold in front of anyone nearby. The doorman's words were not just a refusal, they were an insult layered with racial contempt. Instead of a polite dismissal or a neutral excuse, the language was degrading, meant to remind Johnson that no matter how he dressed or who he thought he was, his skin color alone barred him from entry. In that era, such insults were often delivered casually, as if humiliation were simply part of the job description. What made the moment especially sharp was its public nature. People nearby, club patrons, passersby, and staff witnessed the exchange. The humiliation wasn't private, it was staged at the threshold, where inclusion and exclusion were on full display. For a man like Johnson, whose reputation in Harlem was built on respect and authority, being dismissed so openly was a direct attack on his standing. The doorman represented more than himself in that instant. He stood as the voice of the institution, backed by the club's policies and the broader racial hierarchy of the city. His authority came not from personal power, but from a system that protected him. He could insult a black man without fear of consequences, confident that the law, the club, and society were on his side. For Johnson, the insult cut deeper because it echoed a lifetime of similar moments experienced by black men across New York. No matter how intelligent, successful, or feared someone became in their own community, white, controlled spaces could still strip them of dignity in seconds. This wasn't just personal disrespect, it was a reminder of the invisible ceiling imposed by race. Those watching may have expected an immediate reaction. In a city where confrontations often escalated quickly, many likely assumed Johnson would lash out. But instead, he did something unexpected. He absorbed the insult and stepped away. Decision confused onlookers, but those who knew him understood it wasn't weakness, it was control. The humiliation at the door didn't end when Johnson walked away. It lingered, growing heavier with time. In Harlem, reputation traveled fast, and so did stories of disrespect. What the doorman believed was a final word would soon become the opening move in a much larger sequence of events, one where the balance of power would quietly begin to shift. For Bumpy Johnson, the insult at the club struck at something deeper than momentary embarrassment. In the world he lived in, respect was not an abstract idea, it was survival. Reputation determined how people treated you, whether deals were honored, and whether challenges came your way. Being publicly disrespected, especially in front of strangers, was not just personal. It threatened the authority he had spent years building in Harlem. This mattered because Johnson's identity was tightly bound to how he was perceived. He had worked deliberately to craft an image of intelligence, strength, and self-control. In Harlem, people didn't follow him simply because they feared him. They followed him because they believed he stood for dignity in a city that routinely denied it to black men. The doorman's insult attempted to strip that image away in a single moment. There was also the symbolic weight of the location itself. A white's only club represented the highest form of exclusion, an unspoken declaration that no matter how far a black man rose, there were doors permanently closed to him. For Johnson, being turned away, there wasn't just about that building. It was about being reminded that white institutions still believed they had the final say over his worth. What made it personal was the intent behind the insult. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a quiet enforcement of rules. It was delivered with the purpose of humiliation. Johnson understood the difference immediately. He knew when someone was asserting dominance, and he knew when that assertion was meant to echo beyond the moment, to linger in memory and conversation. Johnson also carried the weight of his community with him. Harlem was watching, even if not physically present. Every act of public disrespect toward a known black figure reinforced the idea that no one was safe from humiliation. Allowing that insult to stand unanswered would send a message, not just about Johnson, about the limits imposed on black power as a whole. Yet the importance of the moment lay not in rage, but in restraint. Johnson understood that reacting emotionally would only serve the system that expected him to fail. White institutions often relied on black anger to justify punishment, arrest, or violence. By walking away, Johnson denied them that satisfaction, even as the insult burned. That decision transformed the insult into something unfinished. It was no longer a closed moment, but an open account. Johnson didn't forget it, and neither did those who heard about it later. In his world, unresolved disrespect demanded a response, just not an immediate one, and that understanding would soon shape everything that followed. In the mid-1930s, Harlem operated under a parallel system of power that most of New York barely acknowledged. While city officials, police, and wealthy businessmen controlled the visible institutions, an underground network governed daily life in black neighborhoods. This system wasn't born out of ambition alone. It was a response to exclusion. When legitimate avenues were blocked, informal ones became essential for survival, protection, and economic movement. The center of this underground structure were numbers operations, gambling houses, speakeasies, and protection networks. These weren't chaotic street-level crimes as outsiders often imagined. Many were tightly organized businesses that employed hundreds of people and circulated significant amounts of money within the community, funded rent, food, legal defense, and sometimes even schools and charities. For many Harlem residents, this underground economy provided stability that the city refused to offer. Leadership within this system was earned, not assigned. Power depended on reputation, reliability, and the ability to enforce rules without constant violence. Those who rose to the top understood balance. Too much force invited police attention, too little invited challenges. Respect functioned as law, and word traveled faster than any official notice. Single act of disrespect could destabilize alliances or trigger quiet retaliation. Women also played critical roles in this structure, most notably figures like Madame Stephanie St. Clair. She ran one of the largest numbers operations in Harlem and demanded discipline and loyalty from those under her. Her influence extended beyond money. She challenged police corruption publicly and understood how to use both courts and the streets to protect her interests. Under leaders like her, Harlem's underground was strategic, not reckless. Bumpy Johnson fit naturally into this environment because he understood its unspoken rules. He knew that real power was subtle. It wasn't about constant confrontation, but about knowing when to act and when to wait. His reputation for intelligence made him valuable, while his willingness to enforce consequences made him feared. That combination allowed him to move through Harlem with authority few could question. This underground structure also existed in constant tension with white-controlled criminal organizations. Italian and Jewish mobs sought influence in Harlem because of its economic potential, but they could not operate freely without cooperation from local power brokers. This created a fragile balance where black leaders like Johnson were essential intermediaries, even if they were never fully respected by their white counterparts. Understanding this context explains why a single insult at a white's only club mattered so much. In a world where respect was currency and power depended on perception, public humiliation threatened to weaken a carefully maintained position. Harlem's underground wasn't just watching Johnson, it was measuring what he would do next. And in that system, silence was never empty. It was often the first sign that something was coming. Bumpy Johnson was known in Harlem not just for his physical presence, but for his mind, which set him apart from other figures in the neighborhood. Unlike many street figures of the time, who relied solely on intimidation or brute force, Johnson cultivated intelligence, discipline, and foresight. He read widely, from philosophy and history to poetry, absorbing lessons about strategy, power, and human behavior. This intellectual foundation gave him a perspective that many underestimated. He understood the long game, not just immediate wins. His intelligence translated into careful decision-making. Johnson rarely acted impulsively. Every move was measured against its potential consequences. In a city where a wrong decision could lead to arrest, loss of reputation, or death, this calculated approach made him formidable. People in Harlem quickly learned that his calm exterior masked a mind always at work, evaluating both friend and foe. Respecting him wasn't optional. It was necessary to navigate the neighborhood safely. Johnson's ability to combine brains and brawn allowed him to command loyalty. Those who worked with him knew that he demanded respect and discipline, but he also rewarded cleverness and strategic thinking. This duality made him a mentor to some and a threat to others. Unlike leaders who relied purely on fear, Johnson's authority was reinforced by his reputation for fairness within his own circles. People followed him because he could both protect them and help them succeed, not just because he could intimidate them. His reputation extended beyond his immediate circle. Stories of Johnson's intelligence and strategic thinking traveled quickly through Harlem, reinforcing his standing. People outside the criminal world, businessmen, entertainers, even local politicians, recognized that Johnson was someone who could influence outcomes. His knowledge of Harlem's networks, coupled with his ability to enforce consequences, made him an unofficial arbiter in disputes and a respected figure even among those who never worked directly with him. Johnson's intellect was also his shield. In interactions with white authorities, law enforcement, and rival gangs, he used careful observation, negotiation, and psychological insight to navigate threats. He understood that raw aggression often provoked a stronger response from institutions designed to suppress black power. By thinking several steps ahead, he minimized risk while maximizing his influence, a skill that distinguished him from contemporaries who relied solely on muscle. Education and self-cultivation were central to his identity. Johnson's reading habits and knowledge gave him confidence to move through spaces where many black men would feel out of place. He could converse fluently about topics far beyond street life, which enhanced his aura of control and sophistication. In a society that often judged black men by appearances or assumptions, Johnson's intellect allowed him to command respect that extended beyond fear or intimidation. Ultimately, Johnson's intelligence reinforced every other aspect of his influence. His physical strength, street reputation, strategic alliances, and moral code were amplified by his mind. In situations like the insult at the whites-only club, his ability to assess, plan, and respond strategically set the stage for how he would turn a moment of public humiliation into a long-term consolidation of power. His intellect was not just a personal asset. It was the lens through which he shaped Harlem's social and criminal landscape. Bumpy Johnson's response to the insult at the whites-only club was as calculated as it was unexpected. While most onlookers assumed that a man of his reputation would react immediately with anger or violence, Johnson remained composed. He understood that a hasty response would play directly into the system's hands, giving the doorman and the club the satisfaction of seeing him flustered or humiliated. In his world, timing was as important as action, and patience was a strategic tool. He carefully considered the consequences of any immediate retaliation. Violence in such a public setting could have led to arrest, fines, or even death, particularly in a society where law enforcement often sided with white citizens. By resisting the impulse to strike back, Johnson maintained control over the narrative. His restraint itself became a statement, signaling that his power did not need to be proved through impulsive actions. It was inherent and unshakable. Johnson also recognized the importance of reputation beyond the moment. Harlem operated on stories and impressions as much as on direct action. Any rash behavior could have undermined his credibility in the neighborhood, inviting challenges from rivals or diminishing his influence. By choosing restraint, he preserved his authority, letting the insult linger as a debt that would eventually be acknowledged and addressed on his own terms. This measured response also allowed him to plan strategically. Johnson was not a man who allowed provocations to go unanswered. He believed that the proper response required timing, preparation, and precision. In his mind, public humiliation demanded a carefully executed countermeasure, one that would not just avenge the insult, but also solidify his power and respect in Harlem. He understood that a calculated response could turn a moment of weakness into a lasting demonstration of authority. Furthermore, Johnson's choice to step away displayed emotional intelligence. By controlling his own reactions, he demonstrated to both allies and adversaries that he was not easily rattled. This calm, deliberate demeanor enhanced his reputation as a man who thought several moves ahead, someone who could withstand pressure and manipulate situations to his advantage. In a city where perception often mattered more than reality, this was a critical advantage. Silence in Johnson's world was not passivity. It was a tool of strategy. He allowed the insult to resonate within the social fabric of Harlem, knowing that it would spark conversations and speculation. People would remember the event, and his measured restraint would heighten anticipation for his eventual response. In effect, he turned the act of being insulted into a kind of psychological leverage over the system that had tried to diminish him. Ultimately, Johnson's strategic restraint demonstrated a mastery of both power and timing. He refused to play by the rules imposed by those who sought to demean him, choosing instead to act according to his own understanding of influence. This approach ensured that when he eventually responded, it would carry far more weight than any immediate reaction could have achieved, solidifying his position as a force in Harlem whose reputation was untouchable by mere public insult. When the story of the insult at the Whites' only club reached Harlem, it spread quickly through word of mouth. In a tightly knit community, news traveled fast, and everyone knew who Bumpy Johnson was and what he represented. The incident became more than just a personal slight. It was a topic of conversation that highlighted the tensions between black power in Harlem and the broader racial hierarchy of New York City. People were curious to see how he would respond. The spread of the story also reinforced Johnson's visibility in the neighborhood. Even without a public reaction at the moment, the insult became a measure of the balance between respect and oppression. Residents and local operators in Harlem began discussing the event, weighing what it meant for their own positions and alliances. The mere fact that Johnson had been publicly challenged by white authority created anticipation and speculation throughout the community. This ripple effect also demonstrated the power of reputation as a social currency. Johnson's ability to manage perception was as important as any direct action he could take. The more people talked about the incident, the more it became a test of his authority. Would he respond rashly, or would he act strategically? Harlem watched because Johnson's actions could set precedents for how other leaders and residents responded to similar insults. The incident also underscored the interconnected nature of Harlem's underground networks. Rivals, allies, and even casual observers all monitored Johnson's movements and decisions. Each conversation about the insult carried subtle implications about who supported him and who might challenge him. In a neighborhood where social knowledge was a form of power, the rapid dissemination of the story gave Johnson leverage simply by allowing people to anticipate his response. At the same time, the story reinforced the contrast between white institutions and Harlem's own systems of influence. The club's attempt to publicly humiliate Johnson unintentionally broadcasted the reach of black authority within the community. While white society saw only a minor interaction, Harlem interpreted it as a challenge to its own structures. The insult, therefore, became a symbol of both oppression and potential defiance. People in Harlem also began speculating about the timing and nature of Johnson's eventual retaliation. The anticipation grew because everyone knew he would respond, but no one knew when or how. This uncertainty enhanced his aura, reinforcing the perception that he was always several steps ahead, even without immediate action. His control over the situation became evident. By the time Johnson made his move, the story had already amplified his influence. The insult that was meant to diminish him had instead elevated his presence in Harlem's collective consciousness. Through patience, reputation, and strategic visibility, the incident transformed from a moment of public humiliation into a story of power, one that solidified his standing in the neighborhood and set the stage for the events that would follow. Bumpy Johnson's response to the insult at the Whites only club did not come immediately, but when it did, it was deliberate and precise. He understood that a hasty reaction could be misinterpreted or used against him, so he planned carefully, choosing both the timing and method of his retaliation. His goal was not simply to humiliate the doorman in return, but to send a clear message that no one could challenge him without consequences. The nature of his retaliation was strategic rather than impulsive. Johnson relied on the network he had built in Harlem, utilizing trusted allies to ensure that the message reached the right ears and that any action taken was coordinated and controlled. This approach minimized risk to himself while maximizing the social and psychological impact. Every move was designed to reinforce his reputation as a man who could not be disrespected. By acting quietly but decisively, Johnson demonstrated his mastery of power in Harlem. Unlike public acts of revenge that could draw attention from law enforcement or rival gangs, his measured approach allowed him to assert authority without creating unnecessary chaos. The retaliation was felt throughout the community not through spectacle, but through whispers and recognition of the subtle but firm enforcement of respect. The effect of this retaliation extended beyond the immediate parties involved. It reminded other residents and local operators that Johnson's influence was not limited to physical presence or force. It extended to strategy, planning, and timing. Anyone who might consider challenging him or his associates had to account for his intelligence and foresight. The insult that was meant to diminish him instead highlighted the depth of his control over Harlem's social and criminal networks. This calculated retaliation also reinforced the notion of psychological authority. Johnson showed that true power did not require constant confrontation. It could be expressed through patience and precision, turning a moment of personal humiliation into a long-term assertion of dominance. He demonstrated an advanced understanding of social dynamics, ensuring that respect for him was not demanded. It was earned, observed, and acknowledged. The retaliation strengthened his reputation across multiple layers of the community. Allies were reassured of his loyalty and capability, while rivals were reminded of the risks of challenging him. Even those outside his immediate sphere of influence recognized that Johnson's network and intellect made him untouchable in certain ways. The message was clear. Attempts to insult or undermine him were not ignored. They were calculatedly answered, often in ways that left a lasting impression. Ultimately, Johnson's response transformed the original insult into an enduring lesson about power, respect, and strategy. What began as a personal slight became a turning point that solidified his position in Harlem, illustrating that authority was as much about control, intelligence, and patience as it was about strength. By the time his retaliation was felt, the incident had shifted from humiliation to triumph, redefining his legacy in the eyes of the community. The aftermath of the insult and Bumpy Johnson's calculated response changed how people in Harlem perceived him. What had begun as a moment of potential weakness, being publicly humiliated at a White's, only club evolved into a demonstration of control and influence. Johnson's ability to turn the situation to his advantage reinforced his reputation not only as a physically powerful figure, but as a strategist whose decisions carried weight in both the streets and the wider community. His response instilled a new kind of respect among peers and rivals. Those who might have tested him in the past now understood that he was not only fearless, but also deliberate. Johnson's patience in handling the situation showed that he could manage both immediate threats and long-term challenges with equal skill. In a neighborhood where missteps could quickly erode influence, this restraint was a powerful statement. The incident also solidified fear as a tool of authority. While respect came from his fairness and loyalty, fear ensured compliance. People in Harlem learned that Johnson was not a man to provoke lightly, and that any perceived slight, no matter how public or humiliating, would eventually be addressed in a way that enhanced his standing rather than diminished it. This duality of fear and respect became a cornerstone of his leadership. Beyond immediate circles, the wider community began to see him as a figure who could navigate both black and white spheres of power. The incident at the club demonstrated that Johnson understood not only Harlem's internal dynamics, but also the broader societal structures that sought to keep him and his community subordinate. His ability to manipulate perception across both spaces elevated his status as a leader and strategist. This shift in perception had practical consequences. Allies became more loyal, seeing that he could protect them and assert dominance when necessary. Rivals reconsidered confrontations, knowing that challenges to Johnson were rarely without risk. The incident essentially recalibrated the social and power hierarchies within Harlem, reinforcing his centrality in the underground economy and street politics. Johnson's handling of the insult also served as a lesson in long-term strategy. He demonstrated that strength was not always shown through immediate retaliation, but through calculated influence and reputation management. This approach allowed him to maintain authority over time, turning potential vulnerabilities into opportunities to reinforce his power and control. Ultimately, episode at the Whites' only club marked a turning point in his legacy. What could have been a moment of shame became a defining moment of mastery and influence. Harlem recognized that Bumpy Johnson was a figure whose respect could not be commanded by others. It had to be acknowledged on his terms, cementing his place in the community as both a leader and a symbol of resilience. The moment at the Whites' only club became more than a personal conflict. It became a pivotal turning point in Bumpy Johnson's legacy. By responding strategically rather than impulsively, he transformed an act of public humiliation into a demonstration of authority that resonated across Harlem. The incident marked the beginning of a new phase in his life, where reputation and calculated influence became as important as physical strength or street alliances. This turning point solidified his role as a central figure in Harlem's underground networks. Leaders, allies, rivals alike began to recognize that Johnson's decisions were measured, purposeful, and effective. His ability to convert a negative situation into a long-term advantage demonstrated an understanding of power that few in the neighborhood or in the city could match. The incident elevated him from a respected operator to a figure whose influence commanded attention and deference. The event also illustrated the interplay between perception and reality. While the doorman and the whites only club sought to assert dominance over Johnson, their actions inadvertently amplified his reputation. By carefully choosing how and when to respond, he allowed the community to witness his restraint and intelligence, cementing the idea that true power is often invisible until it manifests at the right moment. In the broader context of Harlem, the incident reinforced the idea that respect and influence were not automatically granted. They had to be earned and defended. Johnson's handling of the insult became a model for others, demonstrating that patience, strategy, awareness of social dynamics could be more effective than aggression alone. His actions redefined what it meant to be powerful in a city structured by both visible and invisible hierarchies. The turning point also extended beyond Harlem's streets. Stories of his calculated response spread through surrounding neighborhoods and communities, building a reputation that reached beyond local criminal networks. Johnson's ability to navigate both social and racial boundaries enhanced his status, making him a figure whose name carried weight even among those outside his immediate sphere of influence. Johnson's legacy after this incident was defined not just by actions, but by the lessons embedded in them. He demonstrated that authority could be maintained without constant confrontation, that humiliation could be turned into leverage, that strategic patience often outweighed impulsive reaction. These principles guided his influence in Harlem for decades to come, shaping the way he interacted with allies, rivals, and institutions alike. Ultimately, the insult at the Whites' only club was no longer merely a slight. It became a defining moment that transformed Bumpy Johnson's trajectory. By responding with intelligence, restraint, and strategic timing, he not only reclaimed his dignity, but also strengthened his position as a central figure in Harlem. The event cemented his reputation as a man whose legacy was built on both fear and respect, whose influence would endure long after that fateful night.